Alrighty, so as part of our Christmas presents that we did this year, we released a new build of Avalon, a community technical preview or technology preview. I forget what they're actually naming it as. But what I have here is Visual C Sharp Express, and I installed the Avalon SDK that I downloaded. And so I want to kind of go through today and show a little bit of kind of the basics of how Avalon layout works. We've done a bunch of different technology demos, but let's start by creating a new project. And getting these icons to actually work inside the Express queue requires a little bit of magic. If you go up to Rob Rayleigh's blog, he has the instructions on how you can copy this around. But for now, we'll just create an app, and we'll call it MSDN sample. And we see this creates a project with some XAML files, some code behind files, and all sorts of fun stuff. And it starts us out in the markup for the window. So what we want to do is, I'd like to kind of show and talk about how Avalon does its layout. Like every system has a little different way of dealing with layout. If you use WinForms, there's a single layout method that's really kind of tied to onResize, and it's a single pass model. And what we have in Avalon is actually a two-pass model, and this allows for content negotiation, so you can actually do size to content and all sorts of interesting things. So let's start by kind of using one of the built-in layouts here. So we'll take a flow panel, and we'll just put some buttons in here. So we'll say 2, 3, and 4. And if we run this, now you'll notice I'm actually using the Tools menu and calling a little custom script for doing the build and run. In the installation I got, if I hit F5 inside Visual Studio, it actually has a little minor bug where it goes into an infinite loop. So if you run into that, you can do the same little hack. So we can see this up and running. We have our 4 buttons, and if I resize, the flow panel just kind of lays things out one after another. So it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's great. That works. Let's make it a little more visible here so that everyone can see it at home. I'm going to add a transform decorator. Okay. And let's run this again. So flow panel is kind of one of the basic layouts, and what I'd like to do right now is kind of build this ourselves so we can understand how this is working and how we negotiate sizes. You can see when we run this next time, we should be able to see that each button kind of sizes to fit the content inside of it. Or apparently it doesn't. It all fits the default size. So what we want to do is, let's go ahead and create our own version of flow panel. So the first thing we need to do is define a new class. So we'll go into our markup here, and we'll create public class my panel, and we'll derive from panel. So now we want to use this in markup. So to use this in markup, I need to import it. So we're going to come up here and use it mapping PI, and it'll say XML namespace equals local, and we're going to use the CLR namespace of whatever's in the project. Let's look at that really quick. It is MSDN sample. So we'll copy that, and we'll use that namespace. Normally when you use the mapping PI, there's an assembly directive, and that kind of tells the markup compiler where to go get the bits. In this case, I'm actually defining the class inside of the same place where I'm using it, so I don't need to specify the assembly. It'll assume that it's in the current project. So instead of using the flow panel here, we need to do one more thing, which is to create a XML namespace, and we'll use the local up here. So see this name up here for the XML namespace matches this one. And so what we'll do is we'll go in and say L:my panel, and we'll now use my panel instead of the flow panel. And now we can build and run. Compiling. Let's get those bits going. All right, this is an exciting window. So what's going on, right? So we took the flow panel, it worked before, we used our current panel, and everything compiled and ran, but we don't see anything. So the problem here is that in Avalon, we have these 2 passes for layout. We have what we call the measure pass and the arrange pass. And anything that doesn't get position in those 2 passes, we ignore, and we don't render it. This is to allow for things like, if you can imagine this flow panel, let's say I put thousands of elements in it, I don't want to render everything that flows off the bottom of the page. So if I don't call measure and arrange on these things, they won't display at all. So let's go in and go to our code behind, And we'll go to this class, and what we'll do is we'll just override the measure override method. So what this is when we go to position everything, we're going to ask everybody to measure themselves. And the purpose of measure is for you to calculate how much space your element needs to occupy. And you're responsible for looking at your children and asking them to do the same. So what we'll do here is we'll just say for each framework element child in my children property, which the children property comes from because it derived from panel. So we'll go to each one of the children and we'll ask it to measure itself, and we'll just let everybody take up as much space as they want. And finally, we have to say how big we want to be. So normally, if you're writing a really complex panel, you'd take into account all your children. You'd calculate out how big, what was the real minimum size you could be, or what was your desired size that you want it to be. In this case, we'll just say we're going to take up everything because, we're going to write a greedy little panel. So we've measured everybody, and the next thing we do is we actually need to really position everything. We need to put it at a specific location. So for that, we're going to override the arrange override method. So measure, we got to kind of be optimistic. We were told this much is your available size, and we got to report back as big as we want it to be. Arrange override, we're actually be told this is really the final size you're going to end up being, and return back to me how big you actually were. So we're going to do basically the same code here. We're going to say for each framework elements, child and children. And we're just going to go through and say child dot arrange, and it takes a rectangle. This is going to be the actual position on the screen that we want it to occupy. So we'll say a new rect, and we'll position it at 0, 0. And then the child has a desired size property, which is effectively how big the child said it wanted to be, or what was its kind of well, I guess that's what desired size is what it wants to be. And then finally, we'll just say we're going to be a good citizen, and we're going to be as big as we were told to be. All right, so a couple lines of code. We handled measure, we handled arrange. So now let's run. Now this two pass may seem like kind of complex, but you have to imagine something like a paragraph layout where you may position things differently depending on the constraints you were given. So if I may call measure multiple times to see what the optimal size and position of everything is. In this case, we got everybody stacked up in one little corner, which makes sense because if we go back and look at this code, let's close that. We can see that we told everybody to be at 0, 0, and as big as their desired size was. So let's do the work to actually lay these things out in order. So we'll go and we'll create a X location, and we'll say that we want to arrange them and position them at X. And then finally, we just need to increment X. So we'll say plus equals child.desired size width. Easy enough. We just increment by that X, and we go. Let's run again. Oh, we have an error. Unassigned local variable. C# is so nice to me, it makes me do all of that fun stuff. So let's try this again. Hopefully everything will work. I'm still learning this whole coding thing. It's challenging. It's much easier to talk and present and sing and dance and all that stuff. All right. So everybody's in order, stacked together. And when we resize, they don't wrap. Or remember the original flow panel, it actually wrapped as we resized. So let's make that work. So the next thing we want to do is we want to take into account the available width. So we're going to track two variables. One is the Y location, where we want to position people. And then we also want to track what the max height of a given line was, so that when we wrap, we don't overlap on the other one. So we know that we're going to set the Y equal to that. And what we want to do is we want to say if X plus the desired width is greater than our width, we just want to increment the line, right? So we'll say Y plus equals the max Y. Now we're going to reset max Y, and then we're going to set X equal to 0. So we just kind of carriage return, put it back to the left, and then increment it by the height of the line. And so the last thing we need to do is we need to set max Y and child size, desired size dot height. All right, so here we're looking at, and we We're going to calculate out, as we go across the line, we're going to keep track of who is the tallest child that we put at a location, right? And we're going to keep track of that as this max variable so that when we go and we increment the line, we'll have enough space so that if somebody was taller than the others, we won't overwrite them. So if we run now, we should hopefully see our cloned panel. And as we resize, hey, look at that. It works. So those of out there watching the video might question the original flow panel sized everybody to the same width. And why is that? Well, it turns out that this is a very, very simple implementation of a flow panel. And if you look at the kind of the real source code for flow panel, we take into account margins and paddings and minimum sizes and maximum sizes, and the code ends up getting fairly complex. And this is all part of the reasons why we had to have this multiple size model. You can see that the basics of layout are fairly simple. You can in very few lines of code write a custom positioning panel. Ideally you want to reuse the stuff that's built in, grid and flow panel. And with that, we're done. Good job.